دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. Today with my very special guest, Professor Lewis Gordon, who is a professor in philosophy at the University of Connecticut, honorary professor at Rhodes University, and also has very many affiliations at different universities in the US. Professor Gordon is on a visiting tour here in South Africa at the University of South Africa, where he is part of the program on decoloniality and the decolonization summer school. He has generously afforded us time to conduct this interview with him, and we'd like to thank UNISA also and the UNISA Decolonial Summer School. So with that, thank you very much, Prof, and thank you for giving me of your time again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's always enlightening to be in your company and to listen to you.
I couldn't come here even without, as you know, I contacted you, so I'll be in town.
Yes, and it was wonderful because, I mean, you know, the positivity and the knowledge that is gained is so beneficial and needs to be shared, because that's part also of the decolonial agenda, is to spread as much of the knowledge and not to restrain it or to capture it in journals where everything is paid through affiliations. So, Prof, I see the summer school this year is different. It's more on an Africana kind of a philosophy, looking at Afro perspectives. You have very many topics and very varied, but you opened up with a discussion of Africana philosophy. What is that, and why is that different, say, from African philosophy or generally philosophy?
Well, one of the things I find when I'm in South Africa, I have to spell out the word Africana, so it's A-F-R-I-C-A-N-A. Many years ago when I first came, people kept hearing Afrikaner.
Yeah, not Africano.
And so that was strange, but or African diasporic. Well, the first thing is the central point is that the question of what is African is such that it emanates from it a diaspora, and that this diaspora is a relationship not only to Africa but all the places in which that diaspora travels. So the old way some people think of Africana philosophy was as if it's a collection of philosophies from different places. So like African American philosophy, Afro-European, blah, 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 and then they say there's Africa. Now, the problem when people look at things that way is it makes them so separate that it fails to see their connection. The other problem is some people like the view of looking at Africana almost in an imperial way, as if it's over all of these, and Africa is just a part. However, the idea of Africana philosophy is to challenge that. And within that framework, what's the big difference is this. Humanity comes from Africa. When philosophy, the earliest people even to think philosophically were in Africa. That was part of my lecture on Monday. A lot of people don't realize, for instance, that there's written African philosophy that precedes a lot of what people would read from the northern or European side of the Mediterranean by more than 1,400 years. You can go back 7,000 years of writing. So there's a long history of dealing with the human condition in Africa. I also explained that Africa is actually an African word. It's just that many people don't speak those languages right now. And I talked about Mudernetter, right? MDW is a oo sound. So that's that, you know, in terms of trying to think through Africa. But the thing to bear in mind is that Africana is actually what happens when there is a challenge to Africa that produces a diaspora. And so what there wasn't any reason for African philosophy to think about before was what does it mean to be a modern form of thought in the African context. And one of the things I challenge in my lectures is how people think about modern. Because a lot of people think modern is European. And what I showed, no, there is Euro-modernity. That's your European modern, but there are many moderns. But to understand what many moderns are, one has to explain what modern is in the first place. And one of the things I argue is that what modern is about is the ability of articulating the direction humanity is going in the future. So if you can belong to the future, your past is reread as legitimate. I mean, your present, which makes you think of your past in a different way. If you're illegitimate in the future, it challenges your present, and it produces a view that you belong to a past. And so once that has been imposed on Africa, the response is not only of Africa, but the diaspora is what Africana philosophy is.
So in imagining this concept of modernity, or modern as you explain it, would it then involve a level of critique as well in projecting or looking at the way you're going forward? Would also be included in that looking forward a critique of what is in the present that needs to be fixed or should not be followed in order to get into the future?
Exactly, you anticipated my point. I argue that Africana philosophy stimulates a minimum of three important questions. The first question is, what is a human being? And it's because Euro-modernity emerged with capitalism, and it also emerged with racism, colonialism, a form of structure that says whole group of peoples are not really people. And so in challenging those models of what it is to be people, one has to say what made the people who challenge others the standard. And if their standard is simply conquest and domination, the problem is that means if you could conquer and dominate them, then you're the standard. So in other words, it raises the same problem. So it leads to an interrogation into standards. The second one that should be pretty obvious is that if one is colonized, enslaved, dominated, etc., it creates a meditation on freedom. Another, and emancipation and liberation. But the third, which is the question you're asking, is what is the relationship of the first to the second, and what does it actually mean to question those at all? And what do you do when you realize that a lot of intellectual resources were used to rationalize the degradation of people? In other words, what colonialism, racism, and Euro-modernity did is, as much as it extols reason and enlightenment and all those things, its behavior created a crisis of reason because they were using rationality to do horrible things. So the third is what I call the question of whether justification is justified. And I call that the metacritique of reason. So it's a very sophisticated philosophical approach. And the thing that we realize is all over the African continent, people have been thinking these things through for millennia, right? For thousands of years. But as the years unfold, the different historical problems create new ways to thinking about them. So in my lectures, for instance, the opening lecture, I began with a very ancient meditation on these issues, which was by an African philosopher by the name of Antef in 1900 BCE, where he was reflecting, and I read out his writing because I'm critical of people who like to bring up African philosophers or women philosophers, and just their identity is brought up, but not their ideas. So it was important to go through his ideas. And I talked about a variety of other thinkers as well. But also in the 17th century, there's an Ethiopian philosopher, Zara Yacob. I talked about the way he questioned the attitude that many people have towards questioning God. And it's really profound because his argument is, there's no reason for God to be threatened about being questioned. After all, if you're God, what do you care? In fact, why would God give us reason? And he brings out that reason is a beautiful thing, and don't worry, use it. Even if it challenges your faith, use it, because ultimately, if your faith is true, reason will guide you to it. And that's an African thinker from the 17th century.
So are these works like easily available? Did you have to hunt for them? Was it a struggle?
They're easily available. This is one of the things I've talked about.
Myths.
One of the things I talked about this week is one of the most devastating things done to people of the global South is is not only to tell us that our ideas don't exist, is to make us believe our ideas cannot exist. And that's a big difference. If someone says something doesn't exist, you may say, well, let me look anyway. You know, if they say there's no food in the cupboard, you may say, well, I'm hungry, let me check. But if they say there cannot be food in the cupboard, what's that saying to you is don't even check. And what I have found is that when you check the cupboard, there's a whole lot in the cupboard. And not only that, there's a lot that's easily accessed. When I create courses, even for these lectures I'm giving here, I just give links to sites that are open all over the world. Open source. And you could get to them very easily. The other thing that's very tricky though is in the lectures, I also raised the question of how language functions.
Okay, but we have to go to a break, so I'm going to stop you there. When we come back, I want to talk about this, how language functions, but also a point that you raised earlier, and that is the interrogation of standards.
Yeah.
Because standards has become a very manipulative tool in order to continue a particular form of academia or research or thought processes in the university as well. Okay, so we'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me on the ITV networks today with my very special guest, Professor Lewis Gordon. And before we went on to the break, Professor was explaining about the very many challenges or the ideas that are involved in dissecting what it means to have an Africana philosophy. But I think, Prof, coming back to what you were saying, and the two things which I raised before the break was the interrogation of standards and the use of language. Because I know the way in which language is used and the words and the definitions given to words actually set the framework for the discussion, very often trapping you into a discussion where you think that you actually have this freedom of thought, but you're actually very regulated and controlled within that parameter. So how does that function in your discussion of Africana philosophy?
Well, it functions in a variety of ways. You raised the question, for instance, of critique before. And one of the things I did this week was to interrogate every concept I used. So for instance, one of the lectures was a long discussion of what a critique is. But before I did that, I gave an explanation of what a theory is. Because a lot of people say the word theory all over the place, and they don't know what theory is. They think they confuse theory with theorists. Or some people think theory is just about saying what your position is. But theory is a lot more, and a lot of the things that, a lot of the prejudices inherited from the creation of what's called the West is the notion that theory can be, what's the word, purified, so to speak, of its sacred dimensions. But what I pointed out in my lecture was the theological history of theory, that, for instance, in the very etymology of theory, you have the first part, which is thea, from theoria, but thea actually means to view. And what's interesting is thea, it comes from deos, or it's deos, which means God. So already there's something there. But the other part, aurea, is from or, like an oracle, right, means to view. It also means to see. So it's to view what is seen, and it's the same root from which you get theater, where you see what's on the stage. But what's fascinating about the or in aurea is it's very ancient. It goes back to East African words that are connected to sight and or light. And so this tells you something about the history of words, because the presupposition is that this is something from the north, but what you learn is that the people from the south and the north met in a reflection of not only seeing, but seeing what you see. So with theory, you don't just simply see something, you see what you're seeing, which means you bring along an explanation. And so these interesting elements emerge. But of course, how do you talk about seeing what you're seeing when it's linked to God if you're a human being, you're not a God, and you take God out of the picture? Then the problem is you'd like to see what God sees, but you have to admit you're not a God. which means you have to draw upon other resources, criteria, evidence, etc.
I just want to stop here because there's something in my mind now. When you say see what you're seeing and that you're bringing that in terms of the theory, that means that rightfully speaking, when you're engaging a theory, there should be a significant amount of your own input and not simply just shaping what you're doing within the framework that has been presented to you as a theory, isn't it?
You're absolutely correct. Theory is intersubjective and relational. There is a model that tries to imagine theory. The problem with trying to get a good theory is that you are related to the theory. If you could get yourself out of the way, you have a good theory. This has been one of the big problems of Euromodernity, because it has the fantasy that says you can get things right if you could just get rid of human beings. It's there with capitalism. The wet dream of capitalism is if you can get profit and production without people. And there's a conception of science without people, but what we learn all the way through to quantum physics is that there is a fundamental problem in trying to understand anything, which is every theoretical position, every thought, every idea ultimately takes the form of the word there. The problem is there can never be a there unless there's a here. If you were to eliminate here and eliminate there, then you're nowhere. So what happens is the idea of a there that is nowhere actually collapses away. Objectivity could only make sense in relation to subjectivity. Subjectivity could only make sense in relation to objectivity. And the story I was going through when I was talking about theory as an example is that theory raises questions of standards. However, at the very, very concrete historical level, there was a period in which, although there were standards, they were not, how we say, preserved or defended in the way they are in a world that demands inclusion. I mentioned to the audience, for instance, that a lot of the people who tell the people who come in under conditions that people call affirmative action and other terms are being told, well, the standards are being lowered. It's a lie. What I said to the audience, and this is a fact of the matter, in the past, they never used such standards because they presupposed that they had the world to themselves. It's when they had to account for why they were excluding people, they had to devise the standards. And so what affirmative action and every effort of inclusion, what they do is to raise the question of standards, which means the accountability is actually raising the standards. And everybody who has subsequently come in has noticed that they're being subject to higher standards than the people who preceded them.
Exactly. Like if you see what's happening for university professors today, or if you want to get a job, you have to fulfill a certain amount of criteria, which is not matched by those who are holding the existing positions.
Correct. So the first thing we have to be frank about is that the standards discourse is in bad faith. It's a lie. This doesn't mean you get rid of standard. It means you take responsibility for just and fair standards. But that is the challenge when different groups come in. But what's complicated about standards is standards don't float by themselves. One of the things about being a human being, and this is that first question, the philosophical anthropological question, is in how we produce standards, we change ourselves because we're relationships to the world. So every time we try to fix things or make it better, the error we make is we think that we're fine, we're just fixing things around us. But that's an old naive model of people. What's actually happening is when we try to fix things, every effort is changing who and what we are. And so that's that first part. The part about language is
okay, wait, before you come to language, so I want to ask you this question. So within the university structure, for example, there is this whole question about standards. And the argument from decolonial thinkers within South Africa now, and the call in terms of the call for decolonized or a decoloniality in terms of knowledge, the argument put forward is that stop accrediting or setting yourself up to reach a particular standard, and that is the Eurocentric standard, or keep measuring our performances in terms of international university, meeting the standards of international universities, etc. But you said that standards are good and that we should look for just and fair standards. So how do we then respond to this question in terms of the university, that we want to be an internationally recognized university, but at the same time we are rejecting the standards that have been put forward in terms of the Eurocentric concept of knowledge and standards?
Well, it's related to that point you made earlier when I brought up critique and justification. This is where we have to bring our critical consciousness into bear. One of the things I've been doing this whole week is to say we need to remember we're talking about human institutions, and whatever is created by human beings can be changed by human beings. And so human beings, we have to, right, bring out the possibilities of how we organize human institutions. So a good example, one example I gave in one of the lectures is I gave 2 sentences. And look at the difference between these 2 sentences. Women are equal to men. Sentence number 1. Sentence number 2, men are equal to women.
Yeah, it changes the criteria.
Changes it entirely,
yes,
doesn't
exactly,
it?
Yeah.
A lot of people miss that point. The first sentence made men the standard. The second sentence made women the standard. And what's interesting about the second question in our time, if we start saying more, men are equal to women, it means that we have to think about what kind of standards are articulated when we say women. Well, similarly, the problem is why are African universities, are South African universities, when they say standards, trying to say equal to the North or to European? If we ask a very different kind of question, which is what if we say that they need to catch up to the best ideas from here? It doesn't mean that we have it right here, but it means now we have to question what does it mean to have it right here. So when I say standards, I think one of the tasks of theoretical work is to figure out what actually works. And it means that we have to free ourselves of a lot of the concepts that we've inherited. Even decoloniality is an example. One of the interesting things, because this is the first time I've come to speak in this forum, I've spoken in many, it's amazing how many concepts that in South Africa that people take as conceptual tools from decolonial thought that people here think are Latin American. And not only do they think it's Latin American, they think it's mestizo Latin American, white Latin Americans. So even though, again, it's presenting as emancipatory, I don't think they realize that even decoloniality may need to be decolonized from a missiological or missionary structure of bringing the message to you. So what do I mean? Well, one of the things that in the lectures they discovered is that actually the question of decolonization and thinking about mechanisms of power and knowledge that stratify people are throughout the African diasporic and the African relationship to the question of Euromodernity way before the question of formally saying decoloniality emerged. And many of the concepts that were being attributed to it were actually developed by African and Afro-Caribbean thinkers. A good example is the concept of shifting the geography of reason. A lot of people love that concept. The thing they didn't realize is I was the one who created that concept, and I'm black. They had no idea, and I had to show them the text. But when I say I don't mean I individually. I in a community in the 90s of Africans, people from the International Society of African Philosophy and Studies, people such as Nkera Zegwu, people as Olufemi Taiwo in Nigeria, people I was in conversation with from Ghana, people from Antigua in the Caribbean. In other words, people who had an understanding of respecting ideas that come in relationship to Africa. We realized that respecting and valuing ideas from the global South shifts the idea that legitimacy must come from the North. Legitimacy comes from, and that's a shift in the geography of reason. The presumption before was that all we offer in the global South was experience, and then we get ideas from the North. But when we see the ideas coming from us, then we realize that part of our liberation is taking responsibility for reason and theory, and that's a shift in the geography of reason.
But now we're at the end of this first interview. We're going into a second one, and then we'll talk about the language part. And I think you've raised a very important point, and that the shift in the geography of reason, and then it's a shift in legitimacy. Many South Africans now, especially the young activists, are struggling with giving, with articulating how they respond to the questions that are put forward to them, and this of negating of the Eurocentric standards. And part of that would be, it's time to shift the legitimacy and the geography of reason in understanding who we are and what place university occupies in South Africa. So your parting thought, 30 seconds.
My parting quote is that trying to build your ideas through a conception of knowledge and education that was nurtured by colonialism and apartheid will actually bring colonialism and apartheid in a post-apartheid society. The thing to understand is that they were not independent of it. So now the question is of articulating, not in the sense of a purge, but in the sense of a genuine relationship of what can transcend, what can go beyond that kind of epistemological or knowledge dependency.
And that's going to take a lot of work.
A lot of work.
Okay, but we're going to see you in the next interview. Till we meet again next week. Fi amanillah wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم